Delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon. My name is Feridun Handelopper. I'm the president of this wonderful university, University of Waterloo. On behalf of the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the Waterloo community, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Big Thinking Lecture at Congress 2012. Congress is the largest annual gathering of multidisciplinary academics in Canada and in North America in the fields of social sciences and humanities. And I'm hesitant to say that it's the largest gathering in the world, but hopefully soon I will be able to say, or we'll be able to say this as well. It brings together a vast wealth of excellence and leadership. This year, more than 7,000 delegates have come to Waterloo to meet, explore, and grapple with one main question. What role does scholarship play in an uncertain world? It is an important question, and not just for scholars in the humanities, but in all disciplines, in all areas that we care about. This is an issue for educators and students across all disciplines, and it is hugely important for society at large as well. In a complex, changing world, the humanities help us make sense of what is happening and decipher what it means. This is why we are so excited to welcome both the Congress delegates and members of the public to today's Big Thinking Lecture. These presentations are the keynote events in one of the most eminent gatherings in the country. They are designed to bring big, bold ideas into a public space. And they invite us all to consider those ideas together. In this Big Thinking Lecture series continues the long-held Waterloo tradition of ingenuity, creativity, exploration, and collaboration. So I invite you to listen critically, question openly, and discuss respectfully the big ideas to be presented here today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Feridun. My name is Graham Carr. Je suis Graham Carr, président de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines. Il me fait très grand plaisir de vous accueillir ici cet après-midi pour ce causerie Voix grand. J'aimerais signaler, avant de commencer, que la traduction simultanée est assurée pour cette conférence. Vous pouvez retirer des écouteurs dans le hall situé à l'extérieur de la salle de théâtre si vous en avez besoin. I also want to point out that today's lecture is being webcast and will be a podcast as will the other Big Thinking lectures that we'll be featuring the rest of this week. I want to take a moment at the outset, however, to offer a very sincere thanks to our university partners, University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University, who have done and are doing an amazing job in helping us deliver Congress 2012. And I particularly want to thank not only the presidents of the university, but also Eleanor Ty and James Skidmore, the academic conveners. I know this particular Big Thinking lecture is something that Eleanor worked very hard to arrange in particular, so thank you for that. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our partners, the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, for making community participation possible at this year's Big Thinking series. As many of you know, our Big Thinking series is a long-standing tradition at Congress, and it brings thinkers, directly researchers from the humanities and social science research community to an important forum which allows them to talk about important research questions and important questions that affect scholarship in the humanities and social science generally. And today is certainly no exception. Our speaker, Dr. Sidonie Smith, is the Martha Guernsey Colby Collegiate Professor of English and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. In a few weeks' time, she will begin a new position as director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Michigan. As I'm sure many of you know, her research has explored issues in human rights and personal narrative, feminist theory, and postcolonial literature. Reading Autobiography, a guide for interpreting life narratives, is a well-known work that she co-wrote with Julia Watson, which is now a work in its second edition. Before They Could Vote, American Women's Autobiographical Writing, another critical text that she edited with Julia Watson. More recently, Human Rights and Narrated Lives, The Ethics of Recognition, a book co-written as well with Kay Schaffer. These are just a few of the numerous books and countless articles that Dr. Smith has contributed to the expansion of knowledge over the course of her career. Some of you, of course, in the audience will also know that she was president of the Modern Languages Association, and it was in that capacity that she began to take an interest in the topic, which is the subject of today's lecture, towards a sustainable humanities, reconceptualizing doctoral education for the 21st century. As we know, in Canada and elsewhere, humanities scholarship and humanities communities seem to be increasingly under pressure to justify their value or justify their worth, justify the worth of what we do. But additionally, the academy at large needs to confront the reality that only a minority of PhD graduates, whether they're in the humanities or indeed in other disciplines, will go on to pursue careers in academia. I can tell you that as a graduate dean at Concordia University in Montreal, the issue of reconceptualizing the doctoral programs, not just in the humanities, but in other areas, is something that I'm very personally interested in. And I look forward to Dr. Smith's lecture and to the question and answer session that will follow. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Smith with us today to explore this key issue, and please join me in welcoming her to Congress 2020.
I just want to check on the mic. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, here we go. Now I'm hoping I can get all this, this high tech up here going. In 1968, as I was beginning my doctoral education, President Emeritus of Columbia University, Jacques Barzun, published his take on the state of the academy. Of the American University, that was the name of his book, he observed, and this is a quote, "Federal transfusions of cash will keep the great heart pumping. Friends will rally round and bring jam, rarely meat, and commencement speakers will administer with a free hand the drug of self-praise. Then the parts will begin to drop off, as the autonomous professor has begun to do, or go into spells of paralysis, as the student riots have shown to be possible. Apathy and secession will take care of the rest, until a stump of something once alive is left to vegetate on the endowment or the annual tax subsidy." For Barzun, in 1968, the metaphor of choice was the university as patient, wasting away in an ICU unit, gangrenous and comatose. Two things stuck out for me in Barzun's portrait of the academy. The first is the confidence he exudes that the funding of higher education will continue to be robust. And the second pertains to his dismissal of the new technological accoutrements of the scholar-teacher's life. Here he is on the clutter of machinery, the so-called aids to teaching. Some are excellent, he writes, like the equipment of a language laboratory, various projector devices, and certain films for scientific or medical demonstration. Others are fraudulent or futile. Fast forward to 1968, from 1968 to 2012. Like Barzun, we are trying to grasp what we see as the future of higher education. Yet funding and technology are not sidebars to that future. They are driving the macro narratives that are shaping us and the stories we tell of our lives as scholar teachers. Here are 4 of those macro narratives. The first macro narrative is one that tells the story of the retreat of state commitment to public higher education in the United States and elsewhere around the globe, although that might not be taking place here in Canada. Because you're such an enlightened neighbor to us. I don't mean that facetiously. I was so glad to get into Canada after being in the United States during this political season. As an example, here is the story from my state. In a recent open letter to President Obama, University of Michigan President Mary Sue Coleman wrote, "Higher education is a good currently lacking public support. There is no stronger trigger for rising costs at public universities and colleges than declining state support. The University of Michigan and our state's 14 other public institutions have been ground zero for funding cuts. The state's significant disinvestment in higher education has been challenging. A 15% cut in the last year alone," this was last year talking about the previous year, "and a reduction of more than 30% over the last decade." We know too well the effects of this disinvestment in higher education. It includes the corporatization of the university, the casualization of the workforce, a contingent workforce whose demographic is disproportionately female, the emphasis on assessment and the marginalization of those academic programs that are not profit centers, many of which are in the humanities, the prohibitive debt load for students and parents, especially critical in the US, the unsustainable opportunity costs for doctoral education, the expansion of the for-profit higher education sector that consumes an increasing portion of government-backed student loan monies while failing to offer services that ensure successful completion of academic courses and degrees, and the increasing national education deficit. In the United States, for instance, recent data from the National Center for Education Statistics indicate that the percentage of 25 to 29-year-olds with a bachelor degree or higher has, after climbing from 22 to 32% from 1975 to 2000, remained flat over the last decade. Given the importance of an educated citizenry and a knowledge economy, the figure of 32% should give us pause, especially since it is no longer rising, as it did from 75 to 2000. With the disinvestment in higher education at the state level, we are building an increasing deficit in educational achievement in the United States. At least that's our story. And what about the education deficit on a global scale? In answer, let me recite the John Daniels Grand Challenge, a challenge presented by Dr. Dan Adams in his plenary talk at the recent Haystack Conference held at the University of Michigan in early December. Half the world's population is under 20 years old. Today, there are over 30 million people qualified to enter a university, but no place available. During the next decade, this number will grow to 100 million. In most of the world, higher education is mired in a crisis of access, cost, and accessibility. The dominant forms of higher education, campus-based, high-cost, limited use of technology, seem ill-suited to address the global education needs in the decades ahead. To meet this staggering global demand, a major university needs to be created every week. This grand challenge speaks to the scale of the world's deficit in providing broadly distributed access to higher education and preparing future generations for the post-industrial knowledge economy. In all the talk of the benefits of globalization, in all the championing of neoliberal values of free markets, of openness, access, of mobility and free-flowing information, the immobilities of people and ideas, the inaccessibility of information and educational opportunities are too easily obscured. That's one macro narrative that's playing out or being written now. There is a second macro narrative being written about higher education in the coming decades that has to do with the redefinition of what an institution of higher education is. How is the university of the next decades going to be scaled? The concept of the university is being rethought away from the notion of a singular institution in a local setting. Major universities have already become global institutions. Many have campuses in other places around the world, and if not campuses, they have joint programs and research initiatives. Some regions of the world are modeling transnational consortia. In Europe, for instance, the Bologna Treaty has brought Eurozone institutions into the European higher education area, facilitating the movements of students from country to country for the purposes of enrolling in academic programs. In the United States, we might well see initiatives to think regionally about higher education. In his report, A Master Plan for Higher Education in the Midwest, James J. Duderstadt, President Emeritus of the University of Michigan, calls for acting regionally while thinking globally. The Midwest, he writes, needs to develop a more systemic and strategic perspective of its educational research and cultural institutions, public and private, formal and informal, that views these knowledge resources as comprising a knowledge ecology that must be adequately supported and allowed to adapt and evolve rapidly to serve the needs of the state in a change-driven world, free from micromanagement by state government or intrusion by partisan politics, end quote. And Duderstadt is one of those big thinkers. He certainly is a big thinker about kind of what the university of the future may be. Institutions in the private and public sectors have been innovating on the model of a distributed or mixed model learning environment that alters the relationship of the student to the physical plant of the college or university and to professors and peers. The initiatives of Digital Harvard and Harvard's Berkman Center for the Internet and Society are cases in point. The shift to online coursework can be exploitative of certain cohorts of students and undermine the interactivity common to on-campus learning environments. But ethically driven and thoughtfully conceptualized distributed learning and scholarly environments can contribute to the development of mobile transdisciplinary collaboratories of faculty, enrolled students, and lay researchers. And we are already seeing evidence in various places around North America of distributed collaborative programs in the humanities. One such program is the joint Duke University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill graduate program in German studies, a graduate program that resides not in one institution, but in a space between neighboring institutions. A third macro narrative being written has to do with the ecology of knowledge. How we know and produce knowledge itself is changing. The library as a repository of knowledge has radically changed. Well over 60 universities and consortium members have joined in the Hathi Trust, pooling their library holdings for digitalization, what Duderstadt describes as the 21st century analog to the ancient Library of Alexandria. The Hathi Trust will eventually make this digital library accessible to students and scholars around the world when copyright issues are resolved. But there's work going on in that area, and whatever hesitations we might have about something like Hathi Trust or about Google itself, has to be weighed against what it means to have access to these online archives. The scale of the archive has changed as well. Purposeful and accidental archives abound, as do databases ripe for mining. And at the Haystack Conference, is everybody familiar with Haystack? It's the Haystack. Humanities, arts, and sciences and technologies collaboratory. So it's this organization that gathers together people who are interested in digital humanities projects. At the Haystack Conference in December of 2011, Josh Greenberg talked of the expanded scale of research and the new kinds of questions that can be asked through what he terms the macroscopic capacities of big data. something that lets you see broad, big, something like seeing society. The constellation of changes brought through new technologies will affect not only the scaling of our work in the humanities, but the production and circulation of it as well. Scholarly publication is our common term of reference for work produced within the traditional publishing system. We conceive of the culmination of our scholarship as the short-form essay and as the more highly valued book or monograph form. But instead of asking one another in year-end reports or when we get together at conferences like this, what have you published lately? We need to be asking, how have you been communicating your work? In the humanities, invocation of the term scholarly publication directs attention to the end product of scholarly work, the book, and its materiality. Invoking the term scholarly communication directs attention to the processes of scholarship, its germination, its unfolding through particular forms of interpretation, argumentation, and presentation, its environment of composition, its media of presentation, its preparation for circulation, its circulation, reception, and increasingly its repurposing or reuse. We know that we have entered the post-traditional publishing system. The old business models of academic presses are no longer tenable. Libraries are not purchasing every book published in humanities field. The average print run for hardbound copies of a book is 400. The average print run for paper is 600. Confronting such small scales, projections, university presses are developing new business models and piloting new publishing ventures. This situation does not mean that the book is no longer tenable as a mode of circulating knowledge. As Tara McPherson observes, the book is unlikely to go away anytime soon. It will continue to circulate in its revered tangible form, easy to take to the beach, the bed, or the bath, but it will increasingly change, yielding in many instances its fixed physicality to the more mutable forms of digital data. So, the book as we know it will continue on, but it will be only one form of bookishness, and that is Tara's phrase, bookishness. And bookishness will take many forms. If you read nothing else in the next couple of weeks or over the summer, if you're thinking about these issues, I recommend that you go online and find the report written by Abby Smith Rumsey, director of the Scholarly Communication Institute at the University of Virginia. It's entitled Emerging Genres of Scholarly Communication. The report begins with this pronouncement: current print-based models of scholarly production, assessment, and publication have proven insufficient to meet the demands of scholars and students in the 21st century, end quote. Rumsey goes on it's called SCI 8, that's the report from the Scholarly Communications Institute, number 8, to, quote, reimagine the ecology of scholarly publishing based on careful assessment of new genres, behaviors, and modes of working that have strongly emerged. This new ecology of scholarly communication involves an ensemble of actors: individual scholars, libraries and librarians, publishers, computer technicians, and engineers, administrators, funders, and heterogeneous other actors. In this environment, scholars are multiply positioned as not only authors, but also collaborators, publishers, disseminators, and increasingly as curators of their own work. And they will become active interlocutor with users of their work, who, as Rumsey notes, are each and every one potential authors and publishers, as well as readers. But they are different kinds of readers. As users of content, the new audience, she writes, expects not only to read, but to listen, to look, to download, and to reuse, end quote. Scholarly communication in the next decades will move forward through the mobilization of scholarly networks that include not only scholar peers, but graduate and undergraduate students. Scholarly networks that are not only institutionally based, but global in their configuration. The digitalization of scholarly work in the humanities doesn't just involve the transformation of codex into code, the book on the page to the book on the screen. Of course, digitalization brings new modes of research, new formats of presentation, and new platforms for organizing knowledge, orchestrating argument, and virtualizing and visualizing intellectual exchange. The value of humanities scholarship lies in the interpretive capacities to illuminate. The new modes of scholarly communication can enable us to expand our interpretive capabilities by tracking multiple interpretive paths through an archive. Moreover, in a born digital environment, the flexibility of genres and modes of scholarly communication will eventuate in more diversity in the forms of interpretive work, some of which will be singly authored, and some of which will be collaborative, and some multiply voiced. Humanities scholars will communicate their work in this complex, shifting environment. Old forms of bookishness will persist, and new forms of bookishness will emerge. Old habits of doing scholarship will persist. Collaborative habits will become increasingly important. The book, as we've known it, will no longer be the gold standard of our project. The currency of our work will be multiple, and it will be presented not as inert, but as interactive and in process. As Dan Cohen, one of the leaders in the field of digital humanities, remarked at the Haystack Conference, the inert model of scholarly publication is becoming outmoded. He challenged those assembled, asking, quote, how can we wean ourselves from the inertness of knowledge, the sense that once it's in a book, it's done, end quote. Cohen opines that we can have sort of publishing, the publishing of bits and pieces of scholarly and theoretical work, some of which will be in short forms like blogs and other short forms, or in longer form essays. The fourth macro narrative has to do with our shifting relationship to our work. We have new options for communicating our work and for making the work accessible to scholars and students in impoverished institutions and to the public around the world. We can place our work in a larger conversation in our fields, and we can address issues of social justice of knowledge related to the disparities between the technology haves and have-nots, and the resource-rich and the resource-strained institutions in this country, in North America, and around the globe. The term, of course, for this capability is open access. Many of us are familiar with current trends in open access. OCW, Open Courseware, is one such movement, started at MIT, where faculty voted to make syllabi and other course materials available to the public. Now, some 1,000 institutions have some kind of OCW commitment to distribute learning assets to the world. The Hathi Trust, mentioned above, is another such accessible archive. And there is Coursera. I don't know whether, sorry. And there's Coursera. Now I'm trying to get to this. I'm sorry, this is going to take me a minute. I got past. I don't know how many of you have seen this, are familiar with Coursera. It's a venture of Stanford, Michigan, Princeton, and Penn, just announced for these open courses. You may have heard of the Stanford courses that draw 100,000 students from around the world. Now Coursera has gone larger, and if you look at this, the history of the world since 1300. There's one on contemporary and modern American poetry. So increasingly, these courses are going to be mounted by universities with open access to people around the world. Now let me see if I can get back here. Okay. What does open mean? Well, the phrase open access, the ideal notion of open access, as my friend Phil Pichota, who's the former director of the University of Michigan Press tells me, is that communication of scholarship is, this is good, is paid for by academic institutions and opened up for free distribution to anyone, academic students and lay people. And certainly, open access is increasingly a central feature of scholarship and research in medical and scientific fields. Here in the United States, the Faculty Senate at the University of California, San Francisco, arguably the most prestigious life sciences center in the country, days ago voted to make electronic versions of current or future scientific articles freely available to the public. UCSF is among the first of the Research One universities to do so. Few humanities scholars are at the forefront of this open access movement, but Dan Cohen, whom I mentioned earlier, is one of them. Cohen makes the case for open access initiatives in the humanities in economic terms. But economic terms we are not used to confronting. He says that those who make the case against open access often forget to factor in the hidden costs of publishing in a closed way. The largest hidden cost is the invisibility of what you publish. When you publish somewhere that is behind gates or in paper only, you are resigning all the hard work to invisibility in the age of the open web. You may reach a few peers in your field, but you miss out on the broader dissemination of your work, including to potential other fans. That's end quote. This is high cost to pay for maintaining the status quo in our approach to our work. So I anticipate that more and more humanities scholars will begin to place their work in open access venues and institutional repositories, or to become familiar with Creative Commons licenses through which one keeps copyright to our work and yet we make it accessible to others for copying, distribution, and attribution. I'm just going to skip. And the other thing that I think I'll just point you to, here are some of the ways in which humanists are beginning to work toward a practice of open access, is something called the Open Humanities Press. You may be interested in, this is very sensitive, you may be interested in taking a look at what they're doing. Open Humanities Press is what it says. It's humanists who are publishing books, open access. One of the series is called Liquid Books here. And so if you go into the website for Open Humanities Press, you can see the books that have already been published. They're available for PDF download. So this is beginning to expand. There's now these series for different kinds of books that are being published that are open access. Okay. Now, another macro narrative that's being written is one that has to do with the agent of knowing, the scholar, him or herself. What kind of subject will the one who seeks to know, pursues learning, engages in research be? What will be the implication of the shift from the alphabetic self to the digital self? Will we become post-human scholars, and in what senses? I don't have time this afternoon to parse the strands of post-humanist thought. I've been thinking about that for my work on life writing and new forms of digital life writing. But what I can do is offer some impressionistic observations about the scholar's subject that is emerging. Offering one portrait of the post-human scholar, William J. Mitchell invokes the term me++ to designate the subject as a composite of fleshware, hardware, and software. I am plugged into other objects and subjects in such a way that I become myself in and through them, even as they become themselves in and through me, he observes in his 2003 book, Me++, The Cyber Self and the Network City. In this autobiographical manifesto of what he calls the electronomadic cyborg, Mitchell's self-presentation riffs on the Cartesian cogito. I link, therefore I am. We might label this witty post-human quip Mitchell's cyber cogito. This me++ subject is at once custom designed via enhanced embodied capabilities and radically extended via technological devices and digital networks. One way to imagine the me++ scholar is as a performative of hyper-individuality, hybrid materiality, and networked relationality. Another is to see him or her as a conjunction of carbon and silicon. So that's one aspect of the post-human scholar, perhaps, that's emergent. Another has to do with this thing called the Internet of Things. What impact will the Internet of Things, with its ambient intelligence and autonomous control, that's a description of what the Internet of Things is, have on the production of knowledge? That is, the Internet of Things, all of these interlocked electronic devices. And how will the Internet of Things intersect with the Internet of People to produce knowledge? As a recent Harvard Research white paper notes, the connectivity of people and connectivity of devices are no longer independent phenomena. Of course, this is news from the business world, but the effects of this intersection will be felt in the world of nonprofit institutions, including higher education as well. For instance, there are scholars in the computational social sciences who are beginning to exploit the capacities of, it's called the semantic web. It's a way of thinking about the reasoning capabilities in software itself. Data on websites can begin to structure formats and restructure systems that researchers then can manipulate and mobilize. The new scholar subject in the humanities will be at once a multi-mediated self-presenter, a self-archiver, a bricoleur of intellectual inquiry, individual and collective, an anonymized database, a network node of knowledge, that network will involve scholars, students, lay people, smart objects, and robots. And just think of the title of David Weinberger's recent book that captures the complexities and perplexities of the scholar's life that is becoming. The book was called Too Big to Know: Rethinking Knowledge, Now That Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. So, where might we locate a sustainable humanities in all this? In these times, everything seems to be lined up against the humanities. Our enrollments are shrinking, as are our majors. Our funding is decreasing as a result of corporatized assessment and value setting. Our mode of scholarly communication is in unsettling transition. Our fields are becoming feminized with a large proportion of contingent faculty. The humanities threatens to become, as last year's MLA President Russell Berman noted, a service provider within the academy. The environment ahead in the humanities will be as different from what many of us came through in the 70s and 80s as that period was different from the 50s. The change we confront, the challenges we confront, range from the reorganization of objects on our desktop to global circuits that connect us. Our professional identities and lives are being reorganized and re-scripted in ways that I've just outlined. We can respond to this situation in various ways. We can turn back in nostalgia and talk of a time when the humanities was the revered center of liberal arts education. Although when to find that time is another question. And whether one wants to be there, I was in one of those times. And I'm glad I'm not back there now. I'm glad we're not in the same place we were in the 60s and 70s in liberal arts education and in humanities education. We can rest on our self-righteous laurels, arguing that only we can lead the way through these times with our keen powers of critique. We can put our heads in the sand, we can play the victim, or we can roll up our sleeves and forge an action plan for a sustainable humanities. And here's my plan. I'm going to mention 3, talk about the 4th, and end with the 5th. Okay? So, we can forge a new ethics and praxis of scholarly communication. and think of ourselves as communicating our work in many ways, in multiple ways, and through various forms of individual and collective endeavor. We can conceptualize our scholarly ecology as a flexible collaboratory addressing multiple publics. And understand ourselves as autonomous producers of knowledge, but also producers of knowledge in this relational co-production environment involving students, colleagues, computer engineers, and architects, and strangers in the crowd and in the cloud as well. We can change our relationship to our work and not maintain an ownership model, but in a closed system of communication, but move toward forms of open access. And we can transform doctoral education in the humanities. And that's what I'm going to turn to now. For me, the place to really tackle doctoral education in the 21st century is with the dissertation. And that was the work I did when I was president of the Modern Languages, trying to get that conversation, trying to get back on the agenda for faculty in the humanities across North America. It wasn't that the issue hasn't been raised before about trying to rethink the dissertation, but I was trying to take the earlier work, revive it, and then kind of stay on it, harp on it, and get people to think about what the problems are in maintaining this commitment to something called the proto-monograph that has become this, the major defining feature of humanities education. I think we're overinvested in that model, and I think we have to right now grab the opportunity to redefine the intellectual mission of the PhD as a project. The quality, extension, and liveliness of our scholarly conversations and our relationship with various publics depends on this redefinition. So let me suggest to you several reasons why we need to expand forms of the dissertation. And the reason I focused on the dissertation is because that is the part of doctoral education in the humanities that just is the given. Whatever the project was, whatever the Mellon funded a project on the, Carnegie funded a project on how to improve doctoral education in the humanities. But the idea of changing something called the dissertation, of opening up, of expanding forms, of rethinking it, never hit the agenda in those major projects that took place over the last 10 years. So that's why I wanted to focus on the dissertation. So here are arguments for expanding forms of the dissertation. They're in condensed form. The digital revolution requires us to prepare students for new research practices and new modes of scholarly communication. Doctoral students in the modern languages and literatures and then humanities generally will increasingly create and use digital archives and innovate digital modes of scholarly presentation. They will have access to new funding opportunities made available by foundations and organizations such as SHRC, and through collaborations and corporations such as Google. Yet the current dissertation monograph remains inflexibly wedded to the traditional book culture format, and the habits of inquiry and production it reinforces may not train doctoral students in skills necessary to navigate this emergent ecology of knowledge. Future faculty in our disciplines require flexible and improvisational habits of mind to bring their scholarship to fruition, and they will develop new reading habits. Scholarly inquiry will move forward through collaborations, through networks. Thus, the singular and solitary model of the dissertation monograph as the proto-first book is fast becoming out of sync with a scholarly world more and more dependent on collaboration within and across digital boundaries. Remaining wedded to the dissertation monograph as an isolated venture will limit students' preparation for this new scholarly environment. 3, a shorter time to degree with a flexible dissertation model would help us oxygenate our departments and programs. And this phrase comes from Louis Menon's book of 2 years ago. It will help us realize also our commitment. It may help us. This is arguable, and I realize that, but for me, this is an important point. And it may help us realize our commitment to making advanced humanities study accessible and imaginable for underrepresented groups. For potential applicants from non-traditional and underrepresented groups, the route ahead seems formidable when the average time to degree, and this is the case in the United States, I don't know what your average time to degree is, but the average time to degree in the United States in the humanities is 9 years. That's 7 to 10 years of learning and apprenticeship, potentially high debt and solitary labor. It is no wonder that students that we seek out from underrepresented groups seek to migrate to disciplines and programs that take less time, promise a more recognizable economic payoff, and offer a quicker return to communities of affiliation. 4, the time and stress involved in completing the dissertation monograph now absorb the psychic, affective, and intellectual energies of doctoral students, often overwhelming what attention they might want to direct toward preparation for future teaching. Our students will be shortchanged if they do not graduate as skilled teachers who want to teach, who are excited about teaching, as opposed to scholars who see teaching as an interruption of what they're really here to do. They need to be adaptable and adept at engaging classes of various sizes, engaging diverse student literacies, and different kinds of students. And they need to be familiar with and innovative in digital teaching environments. 5, we need to prepare future faculty to write and communicate their work in different modes for different audiences. This involves expanding the forms of writing, the styles of writing, and the audiences for writing. The era of overspecialization and the insider's language and rhetorical mode is on the wane. Our students need to gain confidence and facility in writing lively language for non-specialists, facility in addressing non-academic audiences. That would better facilitate, better position future faculty to engage broadly with the public about the excitement of work in the humanistic disciplines. 6, a one-size-fits-all model of the dissertation monograph is inadequate for preparation for diverse professional environments because its fetishization is tied to the one model of success ethic pervasive in graduate programs. The one model of success ethic is that you are successful if you become a tenure-track professor at a Research One institution. Many of our students will find academic teaching positions in other kinds of institutions radically different than the ones where they received their training. We need them to prepare them to thrive in these diverse institutions. And given that only a small percentage of students who enter doctoral programs finish and then get tenure-track jobs, we need to prepare students to move into a variety of positions in and out of the academy. Some will move in the new fields at the intersection of literary studies and information science. Alt-Act jobs, they're called. Some to the nonprofit world of the humanities workforce. Some to the world of government and public policy. Next, introducing alternative forms of the dissertation and weaning our programs off the proto-monograph as the only indicator of promise, readiness, and dedication to the scholarly work of our discipline will be one contributor to decreasing time degree and eliminating what I call time to attrition. Yes, time to attrition. Recent data from the Council of Graduate Schools in the United States indicates that the 10-year completion rate of humanities PhDs is 49%. One of the lowest in the sectors of higher education measured for this metric. Pondering this pattern, David Lawrence, who does a lot of the numbers crunching at the Modern Language Association headquarters, opines that, quote, conceiving and completing the dissertation remains the chief obstacle to student progress, gatekeeper to the degree, and discriminator among those who do earn the degree in the competition for tenure-track positions, end quote. Time to attrition is directly linked then to the dissertation as proto-monograph. We cannot afford to lose our students and the funding that we have invested in them. And we should not perpetuate a system in which humanities debt level outstrips the debt level in other disciplines. What is most worrisome is that the data reveal that students of color and students from underrepresented groups accumulate levels of debt far above the mean in the humanities. And finally, expanding forms of the dissertation may impact the current imbalance in the academic workforce. A shorter time to degree will mean that doctoral students will not be forced due to financial exigency to seek part-time teaching as they linger on to complete the dissertation. The elimination of time to attrition will mean that fewer students will leave our program's ABD only to enter the cohort of applicants for part-time teaching positions where they are paid woefully inadequate wages and work in far from optimal conditions. Our doctoral students will graduate with the multiple skills and the experiences that will serve them well for jobs outside as well as inside the academy, and this shift will decrease the pool of PhDs seeking part-time work and getting slotted into dead-end academic jobs. These are the reasons for expanding forms of the dissertation. And in our conversation to follow, I can show you one way that a small working group at the MLA came up with of defining what this new kind of, how to reconceptualize this new kind of dissertation. And this is the description that we give, but I'm running out of time now, so I'm not going to read through this, and I'm not going to talk about the alternatives, which we can talk about then. What are the alternatives? What I'll do then is conclude. And, but before I get there, there's always another thing before you get to the conclusion. The rethinking the dissertation will also then prompt reconceptualizing the humanities doctorate fully. Expanding the forms of the dissertation will have an impact on how we think about coursework, about pedagogical training, about professionalization, and about advising. We might place more emphasis in our courses on scholarly voice. We might add the skills of curation and advocacy to those of deep reading. We might build into doctoral education some component that looks at academic careers. We might implement new kinds of doctoral programs in, say, narrative medicine or the humanities and public policy. We might change coursework so that we encourage multiple forms of scholarly communication, from blogs to the long-form essay, from born digital to born print kinds of work. Okay. Obviously, rethinking the dissertation will spark energetic debates and will require hard work. Debates about how we evaluate new kinds of scholarly communication, debates about how we determine credit for collaborative work, debates about effects and efficacy of new kinds of peer-to-peer or born digital review processes, debates about the value of curation, editing, and archive building, debates about technology itself, about social networks and apps for PDAs and cell phones that can be mobilized to advance scholarly inquiry and engage students. These are going to be important debates to have. And these debates and projects through which we can update, become the ways in which we can update another macro narrative in the humanities. And this is the fifth item in my 5-point plan for sustainable humanities. And that's that we build a new narrative about the humanities in action, beleaguered many of us mount passionate defenses of the traditions of scholarship in the humanities and lodge passionate critiques of the new ecology of knowledge. Such defenses and critiques have their place in the current environment of higher education, but they cannot be the end of our effort. Here are the critical issues of our time. How do we live in a world of too much information? How do we differentiate purposeful archives from accidental archives, from databases? How do we know, and how do we know who we are becoming? Our project in the humanities has been to offer theories, to spur critical engagement, to reanimate the past, to imagine alternative possible futures, to model pleasures in our abundance of languages, to mine the impact of a word, a metaphor, a phrase, to read deeply. We will be the only place in the academy where the scale of work reaches from the singular word to the expanse of big data, the place where the focus is at once on the affective attachment of individuals to cultural products and ideas and on the historical sweep of cultural formations. We will continue to be the place of the singularity and the crowd, of the historical and the contemporary. Interpretation from the level of the word to the level of big data is about storytelling, and we know storytelling. We are positioned to analyze the stories that are told, the stories that are being told, the stories that are going to be told about the human, the social, and the technological. So this is my 5-point plan for the sustainable humanities. Yours will be different. There is no one way to proceed. But we need to proceed, spurring debates about doctoral education, developing new graduate certificate programs, seeking nimble, imaginative, and daring candidates when we search, championing more flexible tenure and promotional guidelines, communicating through open access, engaging the public in our work, and about our narrative about the humanities. The time to begin is now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sidonie. That was an incredibly rich dissection of the rapidly changing nature of scholarship, academic culture, knowledge production, knowledge exchange, and I think for many of us an inspiring, logical, and frankly challenging presentation about how to rethink humanities doctoral education for the future. I'm sure there are questions, and I would invite people with questions to come to the front and use the microphones. We are webcasting this, so it's important to use the mics. I'd also ask you to keep your questions brief and to introduce yourself in advance. Unfortunately, we're on a fairly rigid time to completion schedule for this particular event, so we don't have a lot of time for questions. Let me kick it off by asking what the response is that you're getting from your colleagues either at Michigan or in the MLA to the pretty radical and comprehensive proposals that you're putting forward.
Can people hear me? I don't know whether I'm on. Well, I must say, on my own campus, I'm crying in the wilderness, but I think that's too strong a way of putting it. I think, and that's one of the reasons I'm anxious to take on the role of director of the Humanities Institute, so that I can develop a series of conversations on campus. People are kind of, at Michigan at least, so far there hasn't been a lot of interest in significantly rethinking the dissertation, certainly not in the English department. But it doesn't mean that there aren't kind of seeds out there. So I'm trying to seed that. There are some very interesting things going on across the country. If you go on to the University of Colorado Boulder, and you go on to their German studies program, they have just introduced a 4-year PhD. They've just, I think, begun their doctoral program in German studies, and they describe it as a 4-year degree. So there are these conversations going on about how to design programs and reconceptualize them to move people through them and not have this problem of the many years that are spent for some people on the dissertation. The other exciting thing is Stanford. A group of faculty in the humanities at Stanford, Russell Berman, who was president of the MLA after me, led the way here, and they have petitioned the dean. They have come up with a plan for a kind of a 5-year PhD, reconceptualizing how people move through the different stages of the PhD, and asking, of course, for some resources in the process of doing this. And I think that's gotten some, at Stanford, that kind of thing got some national attention, and you can search on the web for that and see some information about that. So there are these places, and I think that's only going to happen. It's going to accumulate. Mm-hmm. So while I can't say that Michigan is at the forefront of this, it's not even halfway back in the pack. I do think that this kind of conjunction of a lot of different things going on is going to lead to increasing conversations. And Russell is now chairing a task force, an MLA task force on doctoral education that's going to come out with some kind of something. I'm on that. There's about 8 of us on that task force. So there's going to be more conversation nationally about that.
Okay, great. I think there are a couple of people poised to ask questions.
Good.
Just while you're moving to the
Good.
microphone, I mean, the statistics, the CGS statistics are really sobering.
Ugh.
49% completion rate for PhDs,
Right.
and an average
In
time to
humanities.
completion of 9 to 10 years in humanities,
Right.
of whom 25% will end up in the academy.
Right. Yes.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for a very engaging presentation. My question has to do with the dominant paradigms of the objective scientist or the objective scholar, and what you would see the role of the scholar as advocate or the academic activist engaged with the community. If you see there's a connection to that and your ideas?
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things about that I tried to get at in talking about the importance of scholars of working with doctoral students so that they understand themselves as speaking to multiple audiences, and of translating scholarship to larger publics, of working with larger publics, and developing modes of public scholarship. And I know that you may know about this. There's a project in the US, at least, it's called Reimagining America. Julie Ellison is very active in advocating for public scholarship. And also Kathy Woodward at the Simpson Center at the University of Washington, they just started a graduate certificate program in public scholarship. So those might be some places to look for what's, some of the things that are going on in that. But I think it's, I think the whole thing about opening up and imagining oneself as having a kind of a repertoire of voices and a repertoire of projects that, that you move in from the singular work to collaborative work with other scholars, to collaborative work building databases or scholars or archives with public institutions, to working with communities. I think the more opportunities, or the more we make that seem to be an obvious part of doctoral education, the more we'll be able to bring our strengths to the public, and to also engage the public and learn from the public about what they want us to work with them on. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, that's,
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
I'm glad that you brought up the University of Colorado
Yes.
PhD program in German. I was going to ask a little bit more about that, and I think it's interesting that we have Duke and UNC on the
Yes.
East Coast and Colorado on the West, showing that German, as one of
Yes.
the modern languages that is suffering enrollment pressures in the new academy, trying to adapt. What's interesting about the Colorado program is that they're admitting, I believe, 2 students a year. And so this, the drive towards public scholarship, towards collaboration, towards maybe making the university larger due to the scale of it afforded us by digital technology, exists in a certain tension with, well, we're going to do this new model and we're going to see if we can do it with 2 people. And so that sort of seems
Yeah.
contradictory to me. Can you address
yeah,
that?
the scales are different. I think that's, I mean, this is a situation in which, it's what I understand from what I read on their on the website, is that they are just starting a PhD.
No.
Or it was in abeyance. And then it, and
They couldn't get accredited because of numbers and body.
right, and so now they've started it up. And it seems to me it's not unusual for new kinds of programs to start out with 2 and 3 students. So that doesn't, that seems, the scale seems right, because they have to see where they're going to get the, what the catchment is going to be for the students and how they're going to move through. And the thing about that, we have Michigan has a joint program in English and Women's Studies. And it accepts 2 students a year. Sometimes, like next year, it's only going to be 1 student. But after 5 years, you do have a cohort of students, and you can also then pay attention to supporting those students moving through, and also seeing what happens to them when they go on the job market, because that's the other thing. Now, the interesting thing about the German thing I read is they see their graduates as having multiple career options after they finish, because they can go into government, they can go into business, and that's an interesting aspect about that. So that might mean that eventually they may increase the number. But you have to, but I'm sure that in order to get started, they didn't get a whole lot of funding for fellowships. And they might have gotten only enough for a couple students. But even, Michigan is one of the largest, not one of the largest, we're kind of in the middle now, we're smaller than Concordia, but the English department only admits like 12 students a year in its English literature and language program. We've scaled way back, and a lot of programs are. So I don't see, I see those different scales as operating together in different ways rather than being some kind of in tension with one another.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a small program that can guarantee an 80 or 100% graduation rate in 4 years versus a larger program that has a 50% attrition rate over 9 years, the numbers that you need to rethink how you're imagining the numbers, what the numbers really mean.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Zishan. I'm doing a master's in software engineering from University of Waterloo.
A master's in what?
Software engineering from University of Waterloo. Yeah, so...
God, don't ask me a question about software.
No, I'm not going to ask you that. So I was wondering what humanities or social sciences might be doing in terms of changing the grand discourse of contributing to the economy as opposed to contributing to the humanity directly. Because, we see this unsustainable growth model supported by technology. Which technologies make, but they are unable to see the harmful impacts of these technologies in the long run.
Right.
I want to see people from the humanities and social sciences to be thinking about these things and standing in the path of this unsustainable technological growth and redirect the scientists and technologists in the better direction.
I'm so glad you raised that. That's what I was trying to get at the end about kind of the macro narrative, the importance of the humanities and the importance of the work that people in the humanities do about addressing and looking at and analyzing the effect of technologies on environments and issues of sustainability. So I think that a lot of the critiques of technology come out of science, humanities, science, technologies programs, cultural studies programs, and we are critical to that. Okay. So that's very important, and you're absolutely right. That is the work of the humanities, and a lot of people in the humanities are doing that work. People who work on globalization theory, on sustainable development, and there's a lot of interest. I don't know whether up here I notice it happening, and I was talking with Eleanor about it last night. Interest in humanities in questions of environment, ecology, and sustainability, and the conjunction with literature, narrative, poetry, and things like that. But the other thing that happens that I'm kind of pushing back against is that those critiques become so strong that there is a tendency among colleagues, humanities colleagues, to want to distance themselves from anything, any way in which technologies, the new technologies, data, archives, all of that, to kind of draw a wagon, encircle the wagons, and keep the humanities pure from this assault from those people who are doing digital humanities. So there's a lot of suspicion about people who do digital humanities, and there's a lot of poo-pooing about how it's not real scholarship or it's just a trend. Okay, both those, you have to push back against the kind of Luddite positions of people in the humanities who are genuinely concerned about the status of the humanities in the academy and want it to be strong. So you got to push back against a certain withdrawal into one notion of what the humanities is. At the same time, recognizing and promoting the fact that the humanities are absolutely essential for critiques of what we are becoming through our technologies. So doing both of those.
Okay,
Yeah.
I really hate to do this, but this is a sustainable conversation, but unfortunately we have to bring it to an end. We can keep going perhaps offline. I'd ask all of you to join me in thanking Sidonie for a phenomenal big